Well, we are now ready for Chapter 6 of The Lions Paw by Rob White. Thank you again to Leslie Saunders and the folks at AW Inc. for allowing us to read this and give you folks at home sheltering in place during this coronavirus pandemic a chance to hear this book read. I hope you're really enjoying it. I sure am enjoying reading it. Although I have to reread chapters every now and then, the way I did the last chapter when my computer skills fail me. This chapter 6 starts with a little picture by Ralph Ray around the first letter of the chapter, as always, and this reminds me of the Spanish moss. One of the things that I really like about Rob White is his descriptive language. And in one place, he describes the Spanish moss as looking like dirty laundry hanging on the line. And in another place, he calls it dripping rags, I think. That's a pretty good description, I think, of Spanish moss. Chapter 6. As Penny stood in the suddenly silent cabin, she could feel the trap closing in on them again. The freedom they had known slipping away. Already the talk and laughter at breakfast, the memory of the white sails spread in the darkness, the waking from the dream to find herself far from the iron gates seemed long ago. The trap was closing. The space of freedom they had narrowing. The doors slamming shut on them. The Coast Guard, the Navy, the Merchant Marine, all the thousands of people who listened to radios were hunting them. They could never escape all that. Ben walked slowly over to the table and sat down. There were some crumbs from the toast in front of him, and he licked his forefinger and picked them up one by one and ate them. Nick went over and sat down on his unmade bunk, and Penny walked over and leaned against the open door. The sun was well up now. Outside, the boat bugs and birds were talking back and forth to each other. A squirrel was barking at something which had entered his little kingdom. Looking up from the companionway, Penny could see a roof of trees over the boat, the Spanish moss a grayish silver in the sunlight. All the crumbs were gone from the table, and Ben began pulling gently at the lobe of his left ear. Nick finally broke the silence. "Maybe an alligator will eat your uncle, Ben." "They wouldn't want him," Ben said. Then he looked at Penny. "There's one good thing," he said slowly. "They think we went north." Penny nodded. "He said that twice." "I'm not much worried about the Navy. They're too busy to bother with one little sloop. But the Coast Guard isn't. And these fishermen see everything that goes on. They're the ones who will turn us in." "Where do they live?" Penny asked. "All along the coast and around the lakes," Ben said. "You saw their houses when we came up the river last night." Penny nodded. "One of them is liable to come poking in here any time," Ben said. "Do they have radios?" Nick asked. Ben nodded. "A lot of them do." "Suppose we went out in the woods and lived like Indians," Nick said. Ben shook his head. "Even the Indians can't live in the woods anymore, Nick. There isn't enough game, enough food." Ben got up and went to the door where Penny was standing. "I wish I could get it straight in my mind," he said quietly. "We've got to get moving. We've got to get to Captiva, but it's a long way." "What's Captiva?" Penny asked. "A little island," Ben said. "There are Lions Paws there. If we could get there, they'd never find us." "How far away is it?" Penny asked. "It's over off the other coast in the Gulf of Mexico." Ben went over to a little bookshelf, got a key, and slowly wound the clock. Soon after he finished, it struck 4 bells. Suddenly, Ben turned to Penny. He said, "A white sloop named Heart of Lee, didn't he?" Ben asked. Penny nodded. "Well, this is going to be a black sloop named the Lions Paw," Ben said quietly. He went over to a drawer and got some money. He gave Penny and Nick each some of it. "Here's what we're going to do," Ben said. "There are 2 little fishing villages near here, one north about 5 miles, and the other down at the mouth of the river. I can't go to either one of them because Dad and I used to come here a lot to fish, and the people might recognize me. So you 2 will have to go. Penny, you go north. I'll row you across the river and show you the road, and Nick, you go downriver. Get as much black enamel paint as you can carry and bring it back. By nightfall, there won't be any white sloop named Heart of Lee." Penny felt excited, and slowly the doors of the trap seemed to stop closing. They didn't open any wider, but they stopped closing. Then Ben looked at her. "You've got to be a boy," he said. "Nick, get the scissors out of that drawer." Penny raised her hands to her faint gold long hair done in 2 braids around her head, and then slowly lowered them. "Come up on deck where the hair won't get all in the boat," Ben said. It didn't take very long. When he finished, Ben stood back looking critically at it and said, "A little ragged, but most of the kids around here are too. And you'll have to stay barefooted, Penny. Shoes would be a dead giveaway." Penny's head felt light and a little cold. She watched as Ben swept the waving masses of golden hair ruthlessly across the deck and sliced them off the boat. Then he got the dinghy into the water, and Penny climbed down into it with him. On the other side of the river, Ben pulled the dinghy up out of sight and led Penny along a deer trail through the forest. As they went away from the river, the ground got dry and hard and began to hurt her tender feet. But she didn't say anything to Ben about it. When they came at last to a narrow, deeply rutted dirt road, Ben pointed down it. "It's 5 miles about, Penny. On your way back, look for this arrow." He drew an arrow in the dirt pointing toward the woods. "I'll draw some more along the trail as I go back. When you get back to the river, whistle and I'll come get you." "All right," Penny said. She turned and started down the road. Then Ben joined her again. "If anyone asks you what you want the paint for, tell them to paint a coffin," he said. "That's about the only thing I know of to paint black." "All right," Penny said. "Goodbye." "Bye, Penny." He looked at her for a moment and then smiled. "Don't worry," he said quietly. "We're going to get away." "I know it," Penny said, and walked on down the road. She looked back once, but Ben had disappeared into the forest. Penny clutched the money in her pocket and walked on, picking her way and trying to step only on the soft, sandy spots. Ben's pants felt funny flopping around her legs, and there was hair down inside the collar of her borrowed shirt. Sunlight shifted down through the leaves which crowned the road, and the huge trees crowded close to each side of it. All sorts of little tracks and lanes and furrows marked the gray dirt. And on each side of her, there was a continuous rustling of little wild things invisible in the woods. Penny felt very lonely as she walked. In her whole life, she had never gone anywhere by herself. At the orphanage, there was always someone with you from the time you got up until you went to bed. You even marched to meals and classes and work periods. There was always someone to talk to, or if you didn't want to talk, you knew that when you did, someone would be there to listen. Penny began to whistle. She whistled "Onward Christian Soldiers" for a while, and then the song that Ben liked to sing, "A Marlin Spike Bosun," But she kept feeling lonely, and the road was so long and so empty. And in the forest, all the bugs had another bug to talk to, and all the birds talked all the time. Whistling didn't do much good, Penny decided after a while. She stopped in the road and stood on one foot for a minute and then on the other one because both of them were getting sore. While she was standing there, two little squirrels began chasing each other up and down a tree. Penny was surprised at the way they would run straight down the tree, their feet hardly seeming to touch it without falling off. And when they got almost to the ground, they could turn around and run straight up again. Well, now some of you are fourth or fifth graders or even third graders. You've probably studied about adaptations. So being the teacher that I am, I can't help but stop and talk to you about those eastern gray squirrels. Have you ever seen them running straight up a tree and then straight down a tree? And sometimes they'll be coming down and they'll just stop, pointed with their noses pointed right at the ground. How do they do that? Well, I'll tell you, they have specially adapted feet. Their back feet can actually turn around backwards so that they actually clamp the bark from the back and from the front in opposite directions. And that allows them to hug that tree bark with their feet and hang on for dear life as they run up and down trees. Wouldn't it be amazing to have that skill? To be able to crawl down a cliff or a tree as well as to climb up it. Squirrels can do that because of those adaptations. I couldn't help myself. When Penny started walking again, she noticed a blue and white bird sitting on a low limb beside the road. The bird was yelling its head off, making a loud, raucous noise in the woods. But when she got closer to it, it stopped yelling and just sat there looking at her. Without thinking what she was doing, Penny said out loud, "Good morning, bird." The bird didn't say anything, but when Penny walked on past it, the bird began to yell again. She looked back at it and said, "Goodbye, bird." The sound of her voice made her feel less lonely, and she said, "This is a long old road." And then she said, "My feet hurt." She half expected someone to answer. She said, "Benjamin R. Sturgis, Ben Sturgis, Ben and Penny and Nick put out to sea in a pea-green boat. No, a black enamel boat named the Lions Paw. They're running away, and everybody is hunting for them. Everybody wants to catch them." Then she said slowly, "But nobody wants them. Old Miss Birch just wanted Nick to do all her work for her. She didn't want to love him or anything like that. And old Uncle Pete doesn't love Ben, at least not the way Ben's father does. I wonder what's going to happen to us. I wonder if anybody is ever going to love us. If Ben's father comes back, he'll love Ben, but what about me and Nick? Is anybody ever going to love us? Everybody has someone else to love, so they haven't got any room for me and Nick." Penny felt very sad until she thought, if Ben's father is really dead, the way the Navy says he is, then he won't come back. And if he doesn't come back, then we can all love each other. We'll get along fine. That made her feel better, and she walked a little faster. At each bend of the road, Penny expected to see the town when she got around the corner. But every time there was nothing but more road, another bend. Her feet were getting very painful. And the left one had a cut on the side of the big toe where she'd stepped on a sharp rock buried in some sand. For a while, the cut had bled, leaving a little pink spot at each step. But now it wasn't bleeding anymore and was caked with blood and dirt. But both feet were burning, and each time she stepped down, the ground felt like the top of a stove, and even soft roots felt as hard as stones. She kept twisting her legs so she could see the bottom of her feet. And she always expected one of them to be raw, but they didn't look much different, just dirtier. The dog barking was the first sign she had of people living near the road. The dog ran out to her and barked. Then kept following behind her and barking. Once she turned around toward it, and the dog sat down in the sand but didn't stop barking. Finally, it gave up, and Penny walked on toward the houses she could see up ahead. They were all as gray and old-looking as the Spanish moss. None of them had any paint, and they looked as though they were about to fall down. Then Penny reached the oyster shell road. She took 2 steps on the crushed shell and stopped because the stuff felt like broken glass to her feet. Down the road, she could see a few weather-beaten automobiles, some faded store signs, and some people moving around. She took another step, and the oyster shells hurt so she had to swallow to keep from crying. Walking on tiptoe, she went to the side of the road where some grass was, but she had only walked a little way before she got into sand spurs and had to go back on the shells again. Penny stopped and looked at the stores, and then she said to herself, "If you're going to cry, you better cry now and get it over with, because they'll suspect something if you cry when you get to the store." Then she waited to see if she was going to cry, but she didn't. At last she got to the stores where there was a sidewalk made out of wood in front of them. The wood felt almost soft after the oyster shells. One store had a faded sign reading, "Hardware, supplies, boats built," and she walked into it. A man in the back of the store was putting things on a shelf, and when Penny opened the door, a cowbell clanged and the man looked at her. "What do you want, young'un?" he asked. "Some paint, please," Penny said. "House paint or boat paint?" Penny thought for a moment. If she said boat paint, he might get suspicious. "Just black enamel paint," she said. "Black enamel," the man said. "What are you going to paint with it?" "A coffin," Penny said. The man looked sad. "Oh, too bad, he said. "How much you want, son?" "As much as I can carry," Penny said. "How fur are you toting?" the man asked. Penny stopped to think again. 10 miles, she said. "You're a little puny. You'll do good to tote a gallon. You got any money?" "Yes, sir." "Let me see some." Penny held out the money Ben had given her. The man nodded and got a gallon can of paint. It looked small to Penny, and she was sure she could carry more than that. "I want some more," she said. "Now hold up," the man said. "This is more than enough for a coffin." Penny swallowed. "Well," she said, "there are a lot of coffins. There's a coffin for Buddy and Pa and Uncle Pete and Miss Wirtz. Lots of coffin." Too bad, the man said. "House burn or fever?" "House," Penny said. "Who's left alive?" the man asked, getting another gallon. "Well, Ma and Junior," Penny said. Sad thing, the man said, reaching for the money. Penny gave it all to him, and he counted it slowly, licking his thumb for each bill. "Hardly enough," he said, "but under the sad circumstances, I'll just let it be enough." "Thank you very much," Penny said. "Not at all, son. Glad I could help you in your bereavement." Penny picked up the 2 cans of paint and almost put them down again. They were heavy as lead, and she thought of the long, long road. And then she suddenly thought of Ben sitting at the tiller all night long while she and Nick had slept. With the cans of paint bumping against her legs, she went out of the store. Penny didn't cry until she had gone around 2 bends of the dirt road. Then she put the paint down, sat on one of the cans, and wept. She shifted her feet to a soft, dusty spot, but even there they throbbed and throbbed. Her hands were numb from the thin wire handles of the paint cans, and her shoulders ached from the weight of them. Leaning over with her head on her crossed arms, her tears fell down into the dust and made little round dusty balls which gradually disappeared. At last, Penny blew her nose violently on her shirt tail and stopped crying. Leaving the paint in the middle of the road, she went over to where she could reach some Spanish moss and pulled some of it off a tree. She wrapped this around the handles and started off again. She was resting when the dog appeared. It came up from behind her in silence, crossed the road, and sat down. Penny didn't think it looked angry, and as she watched it just sit and look at her, she decided that it looked sad. Its eyes were sad, and its mouth and ears were drooping. "Bow wow," Penny said, not very loudly. The dog thumped its tail in the dust, but didn't come any closer. Deciding that it was too sad to bite her, Penny picked up the paint and started walking again. The dog got up and walked too, but she noticed that it was very careful to stay all the way across the road from her. The dog gave Penny a little comfort, for it looked as sad as she felt, and she was so absorbed in the dog and her feet and hands and back that she didn't hear the wagon until it was almost on top of her. 2 old mules were pulling the wagon, and a lanky man was sitting on the plank seat. "If you want a lift, get on behind," the man said. "But I can't stop for you, because if I do, these mules will lay right down where they stop, and I'll have to build a fire under them to get them up again." Penny had to trot a little while she got the paint in the back of the wagon, but at last she pulled herself in and sat for a moment, fighting back more tears until her feet stopped hurting. "Come on up to the seat where it's a slight more uncomfortable but better company," the man said. Penny limped up the wagon and sat down beside the man. "What's your name, son?" the man asked. Penny said the first boy's name she thought of. "Sam Wilder." "Wilder? Old Josh Wilder's grandson, I take it, or great-grandson?" Penny nodded. "Is that your dog?" she asked, so he wouldn't talk any more about old Josh Wilder. Here's Ralph Ray's picture of Penny and the man and the wagon and the tree with the Spanish moss. "I hate to admit it," the man said, "but that old fool dog belongs to me, or he thinks he does." "Don't you like him?" Penny asked. "Off and on," the man said. He reached into his hip pocket and pulled out a slab of black tobacco. "Chaw?" he asked, holding it out toward Penny. "No, thank you," Penny said. "A smoker, eh?" the man said. "Ruin your health smoking." He reached back into the wagon, got a piece of dry mud off the floor, and threw it at the dog. The dog stopped running beside the wagon and dropped behind. "Went hunting with that old dog last night," the man said, biting off some of the tobacco and putting the rest back in his pocket. "Was after coons, but that old dog decided he knew better than me what was a coon and what was a skunk. He declared it was a coon, and when it went down a gopher hole, that old dog went right down behind it. I seen the smoke of that skunk rolling up out of that gopher hole, and I said to myself, that'll teach that old dog the difference, all right." And when I pulled that old dog out by the tail, his eyes was rolling around in his head like 2 marbles, and he couldn't hardly stand on his feet. And I said to that old dog, "Now you just stay away from human folkses until that stink you got dies off somewhat." And he's so ashamed of himself that he won't come near a person. "How far are you going, son?" "Almost to the river," Penny said. "What you got in them cans? Lard for your mama?" Penny didn't say anything. "Glad to see folks is able to get lard again," the man said. "I got to a time there when I was cooking pancakes out of cornmeal and engine oil. Got sort of used to it after quite a spell." Penny kept watching for the arrow Ben had made on the side of the road. The man kept talking, stopping only long enough to spit over the wagon wheel, and the mules kept moving along, their heads bobbing up and down between their skinny shoulders. Penny saw the arrow, but she didn't say anything. She waited until the wagon had gone around another bend before she said, "I'll just hop off the back. Thank you for the ride." "Glad to do it. Give old Josh my regards." I will, Penny said. She took the paint and got down into the road without stopping the mules. The dog trotted wide around her, and the wagon disappeared around the next bend in the road. Penny turned and went back toward the arrow. The ride had done her feet a bit of good, and she soon reached the riverbank where she whistled and watched for the dinghy. Ben had black paint splashed on his arms and 2 or 3 places on his face. "We've almost finished a quarter of it," he said. "Gosh, you got 2 gallons. Fine. Nick could only get a gallon." "I got a ride in a wagon," Penny said. "You made a quick trip, Penny. Are you tired?" Penny was so tired she was afraid she wouldn't be able to stand up again. But she said, "No, I'm all right." She looked at the muscles working on Ben's bare back as he rode, and she thought, "I wish I had some muscles like that. I wish I really was a boy." And that's the end of chapter 6.